At some point in my late youth, after I had finished graduate school, I decided that I would read the books that educated people act as though they have read. This was a very ambitious project. The list was long, the matter weighty and complex. Marx was, as it were, the dominant figure of that moment, as it were, because everyone talked about him and nobody read him. Though virtually every form of thought and interpretation was assimilated to something called Marxism. New iterations of supposed Marxism emerged continuously in the journals and then the curriculum until suddenly they didn't, and the whole project was forgotten. In the margins of American and European academic life, there can still be heard the cries of some who consider themselves wage slaves because they have to work in order to be paid. This may be considered a sad proof of the continuing influence of Marx, that special influence of the great unread who can be put to any kind of rhetorical use without fear that the appropriateness of the use will be questioned. So long, that is, as it remains within the bounds of a powerful, though mutable consensus that, again, has little or nothing to do with the actual work of its supposed intellectual hero. It is hard to remember now that for these purposes, Marx was once comparable with the Bible itself. Anyone who is interested in the Atlantic world of the 19th century, the interlocking relationships of empire, industry, and capital as they were felt globally and in the streets of Manchester and London, can read Marx with profit. Accumulation on the one hand, immiseration on the other, are very present in the world of our recent experience, our global economy. And he writes well. Freud had his long moment. The crudest understanding of his thought permeated our intellectual environment for a while. Everything was phallic. Maybe you had to have been there. That is, maybe you have to be as old as I am to realize how ridiculous all this did not seem to the mind of the time. Only the forbidden was natural. All that frustrated or sublimated our deepest impulses was secondary, an imposition of the internalized father superego. Freud swore he had not read Nietzsche, which I take to be proof that he had read him and was deeply influenced by him. In terms of cultural saturation, Nietzsche was to Freud's period, as Freud for a while was to ours. In any case, if one thing is demonstrated by the succession of such scientistical notions I mention, it is that the transvaluation of values is always welcome. Every interest having the dazzle of a new thing, every iteration having the dazzle of a new thing. That our moral and ethical accommodations to society have been foisted on us as the consequence of a guilty act, parasite and cannibalism among a primal horde, that we suffer for an act that was somehow psychically heritable, bringing guilt, submission, and inauthenticity into all generations. This, or at least its implications, made overwhelming sense in intellectual circles for quite a long time. If this sounds like the fall of Adam, the great difference is that the exalted view of humankind at its origins is missing, together with any hint of an abiding dignity despite all. Well, that was then. Now it is almost as if that somber enthusiasm never happened. I suppose its influence does persist in a certain contempt for social norms and in a tendency to see individuality as an incrustation of anxieties and capitulations, a dead shell that protects, entraps, pinches. But this notion is the conclusion toward which all these anthropologies tend, which their premises make inevitable. A few statements about male human nature, which are not of a kind to enhance anyone's life, were taken to be absolutely generalizable. That passed, except for a kind of psychic residue in the popular mind. Behaviorism, that is the assertion that behavior is wholly shaped and determined by minor rewards and disincentives, was, as I remember, denied half its moment by theories that claimed a basis in evolution, and accommodated their version of human nature to their understanding of brute nature, a view of our fellow creatures now more or less debunked, though the human side of the supposed equivalence still has currency. Least poetical of all these theories is the current one. Now we are merely vehicles for the survival of our genes, and we are therefore profoundly autonomically self-interested, self-seeking. Unbeknownst to ourselves, we are continuously, for our own advantage, calculating cost versus benefit as these words are defined for the purposes of this dreary paradigm. Would primal man expend the energy required to give an unrelated primal man directions through the primal forest, I suppose? No, presumably. This is the kind of thought problem that undergirds this anthropology. This model of human interaction makes us a competitor with anyone we encounter. No allowance made for all the circumstances in which a decent person might not want to score some meager victory. As I write, the economic model that is the real lender of authority and credibility to this theory looks so unstable that it may well have lost its own authority by the time I read these words to you. A little economic justice would surely have meant fewer populations vulnerable to diseases that finally threaten everyone. The vulnerable population will finally include those whose calculations have led them to believe that the cost of fairness and decency outweigh their benefits, and to apply this conclusion globally. Benefit is not a simple standard to apply, as common sense would tell us, if we had a reasonable interest in history. Penny wise and pound foolish, we are losing notable pleasures of civilization, libraries, concerts, classrooms, travel, dinners out, because we have enjoyed a flood of consumer products at prices far below the human cost of their production. So we have to fear what will come if contagion reaches, or has reached, countries with impoverished populations and impotent health systems. These anthropologies, which have engrossed so many of us, have certainly shaped and influenced our lives as well, though they themselves change in the way fads and fashions change. Where actual science is concerned, there are narratives and through lines. A hypothesis is proposed, tested, affirmed, or refined, or thrown into question, with consequences for ongoing thought. It is not true to say that every meaningful idea must be falsifiable, since important thinking in physics, for example, has slipped these constraints. But the anthropologies I speak of are wildly unfalsifiable, without the defense that they are in any way subtle or abstruse. For this reason, we can pass from the Freudian neurasthenic to the neo-Darwinist alpha male without the slightest sign of intellectual discomfort. Nothing is proved or disproved. A flashy new certitude presents itself, and the certitude it displaces is embarrassed and forgotten. There is one thing this chimerical project does center on, and that is the rejection or subversion of what is optimistically called conventional values, values usually assumed to be religious in their origins and to persist out of and despite waning fealty to religious faith. So the project has something of the brio of the sophomore who tells his weeping mother that he has fully and finally embraced nihilism and it will probably get a tattoo. There is something in American culture that encourages these very minor and entirely predictable explosions, for want of a better word. Great causes are lost in the noise of tiffs and set twos that are no more than diversion, emotional play. Now greed is good. Self-interest is not only natural, but inevitable. And Ayn Rand is a thinker. These dicta yield a bland, materialist, invariably justified hermeneutics of suspicion without the tension conveyed by the word suspicion. So much for Judeo-Christianity, and Islam too, for good measure. This always shocking departure from the teachings of the old creeds somehow legitimizes the new certitudes, one after another, for all the world as if the commandments had not been traduced and dismissed for as long as they have existed. The prophet Isaiah is eloquent on this point. These enthusiasms wear thin and are replaced like old clothes. I cannot say they are supplanted because that would imply some degree of engagement between the one that frays and the one that emerges. I would say instead that a looming vacancy in the curriculum is filled by something of approximately the same heft and gist as its predecessors. Evolution is invoked to recommend the primal horde, the naked ape, the selfish gene, each in its turn, and everything between them. But this sequence of ideas is only a sequence, by no means an evolution. This strange intellectual tradition strongly implies a worldview. Whatever its deficiencies, it is wholly the work of intellectuals. And at this point, its epicenter is undeniably the American university. This is a delicate subject since American intellectuals are in general very nice people who seem only in rare cases to act as though they accept or even acknowledge the anti-humanist implications of what they teach. The chic of Europe lent an éclat to Freud, Marx, Foucault, not to mention the whole phenomenon called theory, that may account for the unparalleled intensity of their reception here and for the demurrals of those who took the unfashionable side and found fault with them. More precisely, with the excitement stirred by their names and associations and by notions arbitrarily attributed to them as well. The great men themselves have tended to disappear in the miasma. In any case, Europe has long since drifted into a kind of depressive equanimity. Its intellectuals adorn their societies without special reference to what they say, which can in general be fairly and sufficiently described as European. Things change when they cross the Atlantic, sometimes for the better. We educate differently. Their universities prepare them to assume roles in society as school teachers or as technicians or government functionaries. They use examinations to channel students into one field or another before they enter secondary school, and to winnow out the laggards without reference to the very many influences that affect a child's performance. We try in general and in principle to educate everybody. Our colleges lay out a vast range of possibilities and require our students to make a reasonable sampling of them. Their system uses education to shape society. Ours uses education to emancipate the individual. In saying this, I refer to the ideas behind the two systems, which are not always visible in their effects. It is always necessary because ineffective to remind Americans that our way of doing things has worked, even by the crude valuations of those who are most bitterly critical of American education. We are very rich. If you ask the people who run things now, they will say we have never been so rich. This was true at least when I wrote these words. Any survey will tell you that in America there is a severe economic penalty, a strong negative impact on health that comes with not having attended university. Ergo, one might say, quaint as they are, with their insistence that math majors need to read a little Shakespeare, the universities can be associated with a uniquely vigorous economy as creators of wealth and of well-being, which greatly enhances wealth. The surveys I mentioned can only have captured a number of preceding decades, since wealth and life expectancy are both reckoned on the basis of middle age and old age. In other words, they capture the effects of traditional university education, that humanist, non-vocational cultural habit so many are now so desperate to break. The obvious implication of these studies is that we should extend the benefit of education far more broadly, and that we should do what we do with great confidence in its value for the whole of society. History would tell us this, if our tendency as a country to go from one state of bedazzling alarm to the next did not obviate even the slightest reflection. I have come full circle. I have deplored a certain culture of thought that has niched itself in the universities, and I now argue for the great value of the universities. I find no contradiction here because I am persuaded that this culture of thought is one important source of the present threat to our humanist traditions, which up to now have been epitomized in the universities. The selfish gene, therefore its servitor, any particular human person, seems to make its calculations moment to moment, a little like a day trader. It is coincidental, no doubt, but reliably true, that these theories appropriate the models and terms that have currency at any given moment. Their transitory nature, as well as their seeming plausibility, may both be in some part explained by these appropriations. Animal breeding, imperialism, the steam engine have all had their turn. I think we should acknowledge the influence of robotics now, since the summum bonum offered at the moment is a labor pool who are both specialized and adaptable, are economically competitive, or in plain English, cheap, and who don't know more than they need to know to function as required for the purposes of industry. None of us here would want these to be the terms and conditions of our children's or grandchildren's lives. And we all know that they won't be because we have the means and the knowledge of the world to assure them the kind of education we have valued for ourselves. But what about all those other people whom collectively are called America? To return to the enthusiasms I mentioned earlier, which always occupy the same space on the curriculum, however accidental and arbitrary the succession one to the next, I've called them anthropologies because they make fundamental statements about human nature. They present themselves as science. They mark their territories by the use of jargon, a practice that has become very general in the humanities to their great harm. In any case, I have described what might be called a history of ideas. Ideas that rise to the kind of attention these have enjoyed can only be important, irrespective of their merit. And these ideas are actively propagated in institutions all over the country. I have cited evidence that education has had measurable positive consequences reflected in health and wealth. Again, this is education as we have practiced it historically among Americans who lived long enough to have left a record of their longevity. These statistics are used now to put urgent pressure on students and their families to burden themselves with unprecedented debt in an environment that promises them no stability, no prospects that let them look forward to the enjoyment of the tastes and interests education was, until recently, meant to cultivate. Should we assume that they will benefit from education in the ways other generations have benefited? It makes no sense to speak of education in the abstract without reference to its methods or content or the assumptions behind it. It is interesting that these surveys that demonstrate the value of higher education do not break down their results by major, English or math or business, or by institution, Yale or Baylor or the University of South Dakota. It seems fair to assume that differences in categories of these kinds are not sufficient to have an important impact on the overall result. I have traveled widely in the world of American higher education, and I can report a great basic similarity in the areas of study that are offered, and by and large in the level of morale among students and faculty. There is a strong consensus, no doubt reinforced by ranking and accreditation, concerning the nature and content of university education in America, a consensus that is challenged now. It is not the case that the schools are becoming more differentiated from one another, but that another consensus is emerging nationwide that would displace humanities from the central place they have held in all these institutions. The new consensus is supported by a sense of urgency which seems never to be examined. My point is that we do not appraise the issues in our society as we would if we remembered that there is a history to be consulted. The fact is that we have prospered. Our poverty is the result of maldistribution. If we had done some things historically that are now done by encroachment, if we had logged or mined our national parks or privatized our prisons, we'd have raked up more cash, turned public wealth and responsibility into private assets, which, as we now know from present experience, would have done nothing at all to alleviate poverty. I am far from wishing to suggest that our success as a civilization is to be measured by our wealth. I mean only that by this standard, which has preeminent authority now, it is fair to conclude that our institutions have made a good account of themselves. This fact does not induce urgency and therefore is not welcome in the contemporary conversation, for want of a better word. It seems ill-suited to our moment, where one view dominates. The difference between the great periods of institution building in America and the bleak, tight-fisted present, between the expressed aspirations of our ancestors on one hand and our sense of what our individual needs are on the other, reflects a radically altered worldview. Through the 19th century, this culture was very much influenced by religion. There were utopianism, reform, social experimentation, impulses that carried over well into the 20th century, not always in secularized form. When Martin Luther King said all men are created equal, he was invoking the authority of two sacred texts, authority sanctified by the beauty of the idea. He and Jefferson would say the truth of it. Both texts, the truth both texts express. Much has happened since he spoke those words. Putting aside religion with its excesses and defaults, putting aside patriotism, a word it is not difficult to use, what Dr. King assumes and what we have lost is that most precious thing, the very thought that an idea can be beautiful, or that the human person in the abstract can be beautiful. We do talk as much as Jefferson or King ever did about the individual of the species, and we say nothing that is not demeaning. By we, I mean those of us who accept the valuations that are made by these anthropologies I have spoken of, which are presented to our students as modern thought here in the universities, as they have been in one form or another for generations now, since their sponsors wore frock coats. We have forgotten why our universities themselves are beautiful. I am afraid we have reached a point where words and ideas no longer resonate for us. It would be mere nostalgia to regret the loss of the beautiful idea if it had been displaced by anything with a superior claim to truth. I have expressed my low opinion of the neurasthenic, the naked ape with selfish gene, who together sound like a cast of barflies in a Steven Spielberg movie. They are at very best hypertrophic metaphors that have obscured, obliterated their reference. Maybe the point of it all has been to deflate the human sense of self, to demystify this barefoot animal, this quintessence of dust. A question comes to mind. Why do that? We have it on good scientific authority that the human brain is the most complex object known to exist in the universe. Excellent. But a brain does not exist on its own. There are all the systems that support it, the nervous system, the circulatory system, the immune system, and compounding all this, culture, language, the history of any particular organism. Any human being is obviously vastly more complex than his or her physical brain. His or her distinctiveness over against the universe is hyperbolic, supererogatory by any measure. What words could be sufficient? To support my claims for human complexity, I can cite biology, chemistry, linguistics, history. My claim is buttressed by every science. If the universe is an astonishment, how is it rational to speak in belittling terms about the creature that exceeds stars and galaxies in a uniquely dynamic complexity that complicates itself in thought, as memory, as agency? This is not a rhetorical question. It is by no means possible to do justice to what we are, as we all know. This does not alter the facts. Mathematics owes nothing to my level of comprehension. It defines itself. Human nature owes nothing to our insufficient understanding of it. It defines itself, very often to its own detriment, as in the cynical and exploitive valuation of its vulnerable populations, or in the brutish or calculating version of it so long on offer to American youth. It defines itself also in its creations and decreations, for weal and woe. Perhaps I am naive to suppose that anyone really credits these postulates, though they do tend to be presented as science and therefore as hard truths that have displaced the phantasms of the credulous past. This is the kind of thing young people are inclined to credit. I might mention that the credulous past was much better in general at proposing an expansive, therefore a truer, vision of humankind. The old exalted estimation, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, a little lower than the angels, is given in the language of religion, which is disallowed as unscientific. This is a scruple I would be readier to respect if the modern anthropologies were themselves scientific. And of course, they would be much worthier of respect if they took into account what any actual science says about human nature, including astronomy, which says we are tiny, time-bound creatures who want to comprehend the universe. My point is this: our people need to love humanity as a fragile, self-endangered species who are an excellent candidate for the most interesting thing that has ever happened, collectively and as individuals. Why tell them otherwise? Why discourage them from enjoying and exploring the splendid faculties that are never acknowledged in these grand trivializations? The uncanny privileges of thought and perception. These anthropologies may be no more than empty cultural habits, but they displace vastly better and truer language about humanity. If they can proceed in secular language to an anthropology that is not demeaning, that is in some degree sufficient. They should do this as a matter of urgency. If not, they should go the way of all their avatars and give place to art, poetry, religion, or to actual science, the kind that likens the synapses in our brains to the number of stars in the Milky Way.